You're an agribusiness executive navigating an increasingly competitive market while trying to grow your company. Mergers and acquisitions are pitched as an accelerant to growth, but many M&A deals destroy more value than they create. Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches for successful mergers and acquisitions. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Hello and welcome to the only show on the internet dedicated to helping the leaders of small to middle market food and agribusiness firms improve their performance and achieve profitable long-term growth through better execution. This is the Pacesetter Pod, and I am your host, Joe Mosier. And today I am thrilled to be joined by Marc Mears, Chief Operating Officer of Ag State. A little bit about Marc here. Marc grew up on a small family farm in New England where his passion for agriculture and a fondness for rural communities was nurtured from a very young age. Marc left New England to attend school at Texas A&M University, and subsequently he and his wife have lived and worked in the West and Midwest for the past 30 plus years, and despite being from the Northeast, consider themselves strong Midwesterners. After many years in assignments around the country, and most recently in the Twin Cities area, Marc and his wife now live on acreage near Peterson, Iowa. Before joining Ag State, Marc served in various managerial, commercial, and operational roles in Cargill, with his last role there as the Vice President of Operations for North American grain, cotton, and crop inputs. I'm really excited to have Marc with us today because his experiences include serving on numerous boards of for-profit ag businesses, as well as volunteer services and several nonprofit boards as well. In addition to his amazing agricultural career, it provides a richness of experience that we're going to have a chance to tap into. Now, I can say personally through my experiences with Marc is that throughout his career, he's developed a deep appreciation for the importance of values, and particularly the value of safety in leading teams and organizations. And so that's something we're going to spend some time talking about here today. Marc, thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the Pacesetter Pod.
Thank you, Joe. Always a pleasure to interact with you, and always take a lot away from our conversation. So it's a privilege to be here. So.
Fantastic. We'll put this one out in the world here today. So before we jump into the discussion, maybe for our listeners that maybe are less aware, can you tell us a little bit more about Ag State?
Sure. So Ag State is a recently formed organization through the merger of First Cooperative Association and Alseco, or Albert City Elevator Company, that was formed in September of 2021. Ag State is a full-service farmer-owned cooperative with grain, agronomy, feed, and energy businesses with about $1.5 billion in sales annually, with a focus on growth.
Great. Thanks. So let's just jump in. And I kind of teed this up in the introduction and talking about your personal devotion, commitment, and felt leadership around safety. But maybe we should start with the big question. We'll narrow in from there. But Marc, what does a safety culture mean to you?
Well, culture is one of those words, Joe, that when people hear it, they usually know what it means. But when you ask them to define it, it's sometimes difficult to put into words. And one of the best definitions I've ever heard of culture is beliefs and values practiced, and then expand that a little bit to say beliefs and attitudes about the way things are done in the workplace. And as leaders, it's important that we always remember that we're creating culture all the time, either positively or negatively. And so we want to be very intentional to create the cultures that we want in the workplace. And when we think about safety specifically, it's easy to talk about the importance of a safety culture or a good safety culture, but what really matters is, and this is how I think about when the culture and how do you know when the safety culture is right, and how do employees behave in critical situations. Right? So if in the middle of the night when that train's being loaded and something breaks down, how are employees behaving and responding? And you'll know the safety culture is right when their response is they're putting safety foremost versus just jumping in and throwing safety to the wayside because it's urgent or it's a critical situation in their mind. Right? We've all heard the term or the phrase "culture eats strategy for breakfast," and meaning that you can have this well laid out strategy on paper, but it's really your culture that's going to determine how things get done. And when When we're talking about safety, it's those critical moments in time. Right? That's what determines your culture. And so you'll know you're getting it right when in those critical moments, when something breaks down, when something's gone wrong, if people are focusing on safety and they're keeping the value of safety first and foremost in their response to that versus throw safety to the wayside and jump in and get back running at all costs. Right?
Yeah, it reminds me of that. I think it was Mike Tyson that said everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Right. So it's you got your strategy and then things get tough and things go sideways. And if I'm thinking about this the right way, Mark, when you talk about those critical situations, in my mind, what I'm thinking is it's those moments when you don't have the benefit of time for a thoughtful response to how you're going to address a situation that's emerged. It's more of what does your muscle memory tell you to do? Someone goes down in a bin. Does the attendant jump into the bin to help them out? Or do they remember their training and radio to the person in the scale house to say, we got a man down. I need you to call emergency services and I need somebody else up here to help me out. For example, is that a fair way of talking about critical situations and how the kind of response you're looking for?
Yes, exactly. It's the mindset we're executing with in those critical situations. And if we're thinking safety first and foremost in those critical moments, that's when you know you're starting to get the culture right. When leaders and team members, when somebody goes down in the bin, when something happens with a breakdown, and the time to finish a train is in question, what is the team's response in those moments? And if their response is putting safety ahead of everything else, then you know you're starting to get the culture right.
So given the fact that you've held both big roles leading operations and safety for large grain divisions and collections of businesses and crop inputs businesses, et cetera, but you've also had commercial type roles as well. Sometimes there's a tension between working safely and working to a profitable result, or it seems to be a tension. I'm not necessarily saying that I agree that there is one, but from your perspective, what impact does a culture of safety have on a business's ability to actually execute all the different aspects of what it needs to do?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joe. I've learned over time and firmly believe that safety is an enabler of productivity. And I'd say safety is also foundational to building strong business results. And I'm a firm believer that you will not sustain strong business performance over time without strong safety performance or a strong safety culture. If you think about it, how many times have you heard a leader say, or maybe even found ourselves saying, that we won't put profits before safety, or we won't put productivity before safety? And with the best of intentions, those statements are made. Unfortunately, the unintended message there is an antagonistic relationship between profitability or productivity and safety that just doesn't exist. And that may not be always obvious on the surface until someone has the time to really spend a lot of time in an organization at different levels of the organization and see the full gamut of impact of safety incidents has on an organization. So I think too often we're thinking about it in that moment, right? And not looking at the total cost and impact to an organization when we think about that antagonistic relationship between safety and productivity. And again, I firmly believe that when you get safety right, when you're not having incidents, when people are always thinking about doing the right things, doing things safely, sure, it might take a little more time to do that task in that moment than it would to take a shortcut. But eventually those shortcuts are going to result in an incident, and the cost to an organization to have those incidents can sometimes be staggering, both from a lost productivity, from a out-of-pocket cost, from a business impact to safety, and again, not even thinking about the human side of that, right, which is the most impactful. Right? I mean, somebody has a injury, or worse yet, a life-altering injury. That cost is, you can't count that in any kind of monetary sense. And so there's a business case for safety when you have the opportunity to see the full impact to an organization of having a culture that doesn't value safety, or a culture that doesn't have a foundation of safety that enables productivity and strong business results.
I think something I just want to really highlight there for the listeners too is the unintended negative consequence of how we talk about our values. So if just the mere statement of, we put people before profits, for example, or safety above productivity. And it never occurred to me until just now when you said it. But in the way we talk about that, you set them up as polarities and you're managing a tension between the two. And it's not binary. You don't say, let's go do our work and then let's layer on how do we do it safely on top of it. It's the same thing as you don't have a months-long accounting team booking accruals and entries and making adjustments to the chart of accounts. And then after the fact, go back and say, okay, now how do we make sure this is GAAP compliant? Right? It's part of how you do the work. And so I think it's a really good call out. So to the extent that you can separate this from safety, assume that a strong culture of safety is established. Moving beyond that, in your experience, what are the other most important ingredients to successful strategy execution? Again, assuming you've normalized for a culture of safety being established.
I'd say leaders that genuinely believe in your values, and again, safety, continue to build on safety, but safety being one of those values. And inherent in that is that an organization has declared values. And so I think before an organization can implement a strategy, has to decide what are its values and be very declarative of those. Ag State's gone through a recent grain and agronomy strategy that ultimately ended up being about a refresh for a whole Ag State strategy. But before we did that, we very intentionally implemented values of respect, integrity, safety, and excellence. So the acronym RISE is how we think of our values. Now, almost a year ago now, those were put together and implemented in the organization, and I'd say has done very well. One of the things that helped enable that is as we were at our leadership team retreat almost a year ago, Troy Yupa, our CEO, asked that we start every meeting with a values contact to foster and nurture that culture of values in the organization. That's one thing that we've tried very hard to honor through the year. And I say, and I look back over the past year and people ask me, one of the things that Ag State's done very well in the past year? There's a lot, but one of the things I look at and I point to the implementation of our values that laid the foundation to implement our strategy. And so you have to have leaders that understand the values, that live the values, that make the values real in the organization. Processes, systems, documents are all important, but they won't matter if you don't have the right leadership culture and people that genuinely believe and live their values very visibly in the organization.
Absolutely. So kind of building upon that, because there's multiple things. I'm thinking of almost like a pyramid. You get your foundation of safety, or perhaps it's a foundation of values upon which then the culture of safety is built, and you kind of move along, and eventually all those beloved processes and documents and systems, the world that I live in, that I love deeply, all comes into play. But when you in your role coming into an organization are looking at, okay, who are we? What are we trying to accomplish? What is it we want to do? And then you look at a new strategy, a new strategic vision, a new go-to-market approach, whatever it might be. How do you personally, as a leader, Mark, how do you assess a business or a team's readiness to execute strategy?
Yeah, so maybe back up even a little bit further, and when you're developing that strategy, right? So as leaders in an organization are developing that strategy, it's making sure the right people are involved. And it's easy to have the top of the house involved in that, but it's also important to get the key leaders and influences involved in the strategy, both as it's being developed and then in the initial phases of implementation. Again, one of the things that I think we did well in Ag State was we brought, once we had a pretty thorough draft, I won't say a final draft, but a fairly comprehensive draft of the strategy put together, we got key leaders and influencers from Ag State into a room and shared it and asked for feedback. And through that process, took that feedback, made a few changes, and then also as a next level rollout, took those changes that were recommended and sat down with each location team, shared it, and again, took their feedback that resulted in the document that we have today. And it didn't necessarily change the overall direction of the strategy, but it made it more real, refined it, helped people understand some of the things that were concerns. And it's rare in modern agricultural businesses that cost cutting or efficiencies aren't some component of the strategy, and that there's always some sensitivity when people hear costs. There's sometimes an immediate assumption that, well, we're eliminating jobs or something is going to negatively impact me, and that's not always the case at all. And so if you can help people better understand where those costs are going to be taken out or where those efficiencies are going to be gained, then they become, advocates, and you got the whole organization look, rather than, being fearful of these changes, you've got the organization almost, actively engaged in how do we achieve it, right? And so you can quickly start to see the change. And when the responses and the questions move from concern to excitement, then you'll know the organization's ready to move forward and implement. And you can't wait until 100% of the employee population is, gets it and is ready. But when your key leaders, when your key influencers, when the people that are, leading the teams day in and day out get it and they're excited about it, then you'll know you're ready to move forward.
Interesting.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
There's clearly a trade-off there. Just think about in terms of efficiency. I mean, it's going to take longer to do that, but I'm going to guess that the time you invested up front and getting the input, the feedback, and the buy-in then is an accelerant after the fact.
Absolutely. You're not having to come back a year or 2 years later disappointed with the implementation and have to do a redo, right? You're spending the time up front to make sure the organization's ready, to make sure you're candid, you're transparent with what we're trying to do, listening for feedback. And the key is listening for feedback and making sure that all the questions are answered. And again, you got to know who the key leaders and influences are. And that's not always just by title, right? Sometimes it's, an individual might not have any direct reports, but they're, a key leader and influencer in the business. And, it's just as important to engage their hearts and minds as it is, the senior leadership team of the organization.
And so the thought here is, as you described that, you ultimately worked through that process, got the buy-in and got the excitement that you were looking for, and didn't have substantive changes to the heart of the strategy that you're bringing forward. And I think that's the best possible outcome.
Yeah, and the only thing I would say is that's a present tense. We're working, right? So
Sure.
This is ongoing as we speak. So.
Yeah, and I think a hesitation some folks have is if you bring it out there and there's a lot of feedback, it's going to be this ever existing work in progress. Nothing will get decided. We won't ever move forward. And so you have that hesitation. You also have some folks that I've worked with in the past that they fall in love with their ideas. And that strategy document that comes out of the executive offsite, the mindset that they have when they go out to do the roadshow, I think kind of works at cross purposes. And so I think for folks that are going to be undertaking this work or actively doing it, I agree with Mark 100%. You have to take it out on the road. You have to get a lot of people's input and perspectives and frankly, their reactions. But you also have to think about the mindset you have when you bring it out there. If you're going out saying, I want to describe our thinking to people, and then use their responses and their inputs to improve our thinking, you're setting yourself up for success. If you go out there with the mindset of we have to sell this, that to me signals that you've probably already become anchored and cemented to the product features or the strategy features that you have. And so people will see through that. And so I think when you go out to talk to these groups, whether it's elevator operators, if it's your on-farm sales force, if it's the folks in the back office that are doing contract settlement, whatever it is, you have to say, okay, look, I'm here to describe our thinking and then to ask for you to help improve our thinking rather than I'm here to tell you why this is what we need to do. And success is measured as if you agree with me at the end of this meeting. Because if you're looking for agreement right out of the gates, you're setting up an adversarial sort of relationship or perhaps an unproductive tension.
And you want to engage people and make sure there's enthusiasm for the changes that are going to be made. Right? And changes it's important to manage change, and change is often assumed it's much easier to make than it is in organizations. And so acknowledge that, this is change, and making sure that we're listening and taking people's feedback doesn't necessarily mean it changes the outcome, but the communication, the documents, making sure there's enough detail and understanding at a granular level about where we're going as an organization, that people are bought in, and there's excitement and enthusiasm for the strategy. Again, with the key leaders and influencers in the business.
Yeah. Well said, Mark. Thank you. So let's take a little bit of a different angle here. And just as a preamble, when I think about strategy execution, of course, you have to consider your culture. You have to consider your people, your talent. You have to think about your processes, your technologies. There's a lot of different elements to thinking about strategy execution. But business structure is a big one. And sometimes people say it doesn't matter. Just get the right people and the work will get done. I think they're wrong. Also, other people say, get the right structure and it'll all solve itself. And I also don't know that that's necessarily true. But because we know people love to come in and put their fingerprints on structure, like it's like moving pieces on the chessboard, and you feel at the end of it, you feel great, right? You got the new org chart, you got the new operating model, whatever it is. So we see a lot of businesses and leaders spend a lot of time working on this, tweaking it and trying to perfect it. With all that said, I'd love to get your thoughts on that idea, but also for you, what is the right balance between trying to optimize the structure that you want with really capitalizing on the skills and the abilities of the people that you have? How do you think about that?
Well, that's a great question, Joe, and you framed it up well. And I'll start with the answer to your question, and then back into it. Both are important, right? It's important to have the right structure, and more important to have the right people. Right. So, and you nailed it. Too often leaders spend so much time on structure, and when we think structure, we're talking about org charts, right? And so I've got to get the right organizational structure, and it's something that it's impactful. It's changed, something that I can say, this is what I've done as a leader, right? Or this is what we've done as a leadership team. We've changed the structure. We've restructured the organization. And, if anybody's worked long enough, they've probably unfortunately been part of organizations that just spend constant restructuring and nothing's ever really settled, and the organization just gets change weary and it becomes pointless, and people don't even get new business cards anymore because they know it's just going to change again, right? And so, but yet it's something that we can point to and say, look at what we did, right? And again, we're having a little fun with it, but it's important to have the right structure, right? And so you can't not have the right organizational structure, but when it's between structure and people, you've got to have the right people. You can have the best structure in the world, and you can have everything can be right, and if you don't have the right people, it's never going to be right. Right? We often heard, well, get your structure right, or don't build your structure around your people. And that is important, I think, particularly in new organizations, newly formed organizations, or larger organizations. It's important, probably more important, not to build your structure around your people. But at the same time, when you've got that right, when you've got the right balance of people, when you got the right balance of structure, you can avoid these big restructurings, these very disruptive to customers and disruptive to organization structure changes, because you can make changes as it makes sense. And so as you have an opening because somebody retires or somebody takes a promotion, then you can tweak the structure as you go and not have to have these disruptive structural changes when you get that right. So I think it's very important to get it right, both with people and structure in the beginning of an organization. And you'll never get it perfect. There'll always be a few tweaks that you have to make. But then once it starts to take shape and you've got it right, you've got that right balance of structure and people, and what I call the right people doing the right things is how I think about that, then it'll just feel right to the organization, and you'll know it. And there'll be opportunities. You'll strategically plan for them with pending retirements to make the changes that need to be made. And you can avoid these disruptive structure changes that you alluded to that people like to put their fingerprint on, and sometimes are more about being able to show a board of directors or the owners of an organization that, this is what we're doing because it's visible, it's decisive, and a lot of times it's just simply disruptive to an organization and doesn't achieve the intent until we're restructuring again in 1 or 2 years. And like I say, I've seen enough structures to know that when it's right, and it can last a long time and be very good for customers and be very good for employees.
Yeah, I think there's actually a pretty simple way to short circuit a ill-advised structural change effort, and because people will get really excited about it for all the reasons you just said, Mark. People get really excited about the new structure, and they'll explain why it's great, what it's going to create, what it's going to enable, etc. But I found that and I think because you've asked me this question several times throughout our shared career, what problem are we solving here? So I know you're excited about the idea, but what problem does this restructure solve? And if the answer is, Bob is just a top shelf, top quartile salesperson, and he's within spitting distance of retirement, and he's got the secret sauce, and we need to have a professional sales organization, so we're going to restructure commercially because we want to replicate Bob. It's saying, well, maybe that's the solution. Maybe first we should just focus in on what Bob does well and figure out how you can harvest that set of behaviors, that knowledge, that skills, that relationship building, whatever it is. If the concern is we've got a vulnerability because we got too much of our organizational power is centered in a couple of people and they don't have redundancies, and there's no way to transition that, you can focus there and maybe you arrive at a restructure is the right ultimate long-term path. But to default there, I think, is maybe short-sighted. And so again, if we always stay rooted in what problem are we actually solving, I think some of these organizational restructure efforts it'll knock the wind out of them and they'll run out of steam pretty quickly.
I call that solutions in search of a problem. So we have enough problems in our industry that we need to find solutions for. We don't need to be in search of a problem with a solution.
You don't need to manufacture new ones. Well, Mark, one question here as we kind of take it to the close, and I know this is a little bit of a jumping around here a little bit, but you've held a lot of different roles in a lot of different places in a lot of different parts of the ag supply chain over the last 3+ decades. What are the reasons that you have right now to either be bullish or bearish on agribusiness?
So I think we often, and to an extent it is, our industry is cyclical. But I think as you look at the global economy, you look at the global supply chain of agriculture, and I think particularly for young people coming into the organization that want a career in agriculture, you can't help but to be bullish, right? And there'll always be these little downturns and commodity cycles. But if you're looking to invest in the industry, either from a career perspective or from a business in search of investments, you have to look at agriculture, and it's the front end of a lot of supply chains, and you have to be excited about the industry. And I've got a 22-year-old daughter that's going to be finishing college soon, who's studying agriculture, and I think she has no idea the opportunities that she has in front of her, right? And I look back and I'm obviously closer to the end than the beginning. But I look back and I think how blessed and fortunate I've been to be part of an industry that serves so many people in so many different ways, right? Whether it be the small communities that we're a part of in the businesses in Ag State or other communities and businesses I've had privilege of being a part of before coming to Ag State. Again, I think you have to be bullish on both the business opportunities as well as just the opportunity to do some good in the world in agriculture. So.
Well, I couldn't conceive of a better way to bring this to a close here today, Mark. So I just want to say thank you again for taking some time, spending some time with us today here on the Pacesetter Pod. And I wish you continued success and progress over at Ag State.
It's been a pleasure, Joe. Thank you for the opportunity to join you.
You bet. And thank you also to our listeners for tuning in today. Before we go, as always, I have a few things I'd like to ask you to do. Share the Pacesetter Pod. Particularly share it with others in our industry that you think could benefit from the content and from the conversations. This is a project that's meant to enrich the conversations in the space. And the more people that have access to it, the more benefit we can have and the more learning we can all collectively enjoy. I'd also encourage you to follow, connect with me, Joe Mosier, on LinkedIn. And be sure to visit us online at mosiercg.com, where you can set up a call, Download our white paper on integration pace setter process for post M&A integration and a lot of other interesting resources. And as always, remember that this show is for you. We've got a lot of things that we love to talk about here and a lot of interesting people we want to talk to. But if you think there's someone else we need to be talking to, if you think there's another topic you'd like us to unpack and explore together, we need to know. Let us know what's on your mind so that we can invest in things that are important to you and your business. So thank you again for listening to the Pace Setter Pod today, and have a safe day.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.